Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Israel Matters. We've got a lot on our plate. It's never a dull week in the Middle East. No week is just another week, as it is, Elliot?
That's right. There's always something. You don't know what it's going to be in advance, but there's going to be
Yeah,
something.
it's never boring. So before we get to everything that we want to talk about on the Israel front, I just wanted to mention a lot of our viewers, those who are Christian may not be aware, with Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, which is really the day of trumpets, the day of judgment, of the coronation of the king, coming up next week. We began a period, well, for Ashkenazic Jews, we began it last night. For Sephardic Jews, it began a few weeks ago. We began saying special penitential prayers called Selichot, which literally means forgiveness, where they are extra prayers that are just focused on asking forgiveness from God. And a lot of them are very ancient hymns that have been said for many centuries. And we incorporate verses asking God for forgiveness. And one interesting note about these special prayers, we're going to be saying them from now until after the day of, we're going to be saying them from now until the Day of Atonement. And the time to say them is prior to the morning service. Ideally, they're said between midnight and sunrise, meaning in the second half of the night. And what's significant about that is that we have, obviously Jews pray 3 times a day. We have morning prayers, which have to be said in the beginning of the day, the first few hours of the day. And then we have afternoon prayers for the second half of the day. And then we have evening prayers, which are said from nightfall until midnight. You're not really supposed to say the evening prayers after midnight, which means that the one quadrant of the day that doesn't have a prayer service on a daily basis is the second half of the night. And when we get to this time of year and the Selichot, the particular timing of them in the day, one of the effects that it has is it gives us prayers to be said in the second half of the night. And the symbolism of that is very powerful for the times that we live in as well, that our morning prayers are filled with optimism and speaking of the new day and seeing God's blessings in the world. Our evening prayers focus very much on exile and being saved from harm and from danger, because we're heading into the nighttime. So symbolically, the nighttime represents the dark times. And I think having the prayers for forgiveness come at the end of the night is also very symbolic, that the way we get out of the darkness, the way we get out of the exile, and the way we come out into the light of redemption is really through repentance and through beseeching God to have, to bestow his grace upon us and forgive us for our sins. And that itself is an emergence from exile, both on a personal level and a national level. I just wanted to share that perspective and also educate some of our viewers of this practice called Selichot, these special prayers for this time of year. And on a personal level, it's more stuff to say every day, but it also, we try to infuse it with meaning. Some of these ancient hymns are a bit hard to relate to, actually, but this is a very spiritually charged time of year. Okay, let's get on with the issues here. Yeah, thank you. So Elliot, my first question is, we just saw just the other day another announcement, which we saw coming. Back when we discussed the United Arab Emirates-Israel peace deal, we talked about the fact that we expected that right around the corner, the other Gulf states, well, not Qatar, but the friendlier Gulf states, right, Oman, Bahrain, would be on board, and we'd be seeing them coming on board soon. I don't know if we expected it to be this soon. It could have to do with the timing of the signing ceremony. But what are your thoughts, first of all, on Bahrain? And specifically, as someone who's, I think I speak for a lot of people here, what's the difference between Bahrain and the Emirates and Oman? And are they all really kind of the same thing? And what does this mean for further implications for Israel and for the Palestinians?
Okay, so let me start with the sort of the middle question there. They are different, but not on a level that makes a difference to us in terms of is it preferable to have one or the other when they're all coming on board? In other words, if we want to go back to the 70s when Sadat came to Jerusalem and Egypt then signed an agreement in 79, that was earth-shaking for a whole bunch of reasons. Egypt it was first of all the first country. It was a confrontation state that we fought direct wars with. It was the most powerful and remains the most powerful Arab country. So Egypt was this kind of story in and of itself. The Emirates, Bahrain, Oman, even Saudi Arabia are important in their own right. And Saudi Arabia is maybe additional importance for other reasons, including landmass. But now we're in a different place. These are actors that are falling into line and sort of piling on almost. So is Bahrain more important than Kuwait, which hasn't done anything yet? I think they're a little too close to Iraq to mess around at this stage. But Oman, and I said even Saudi Arabia, from our perspective, the specific differences between them is less important as a subject than the fact that they're coming around one after another, that the Arab League rejected the Palestinian demand to condemn the original Emirates-Israel treaty. In other words, there's been...
By the way, on that point, it seemed like a real mistake of the Palestinians to even make the demand. I can't imagine that they thought that the Arab League would condemn the United Arab Emirates. But if they did, I mean, they're obviously delusional, but it seemed like a real tactical mistake on their part, because all it did was invite a rejection of their demand.
Let's say that the Book of Palestinian Tactical and Strategic Mistakes is a multi-volume work, and each volume is enormous. So they are almost a model of how not to do it. And so I'm not surprised, because as Abba Eban said back in the day, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. They've actually graduated. They've actually created their own opportunities to miss opportunities. But so they have been absolutely taken off center stage, at least on the level of it can't be solved without them, because clearly it can be. They've completely overplayed their hand. And we've talked about this, both in terms of aid, in terms of agreement. All the agreements have been there, they've been set, and they've walked away from them. And anybody who thinks that the last 20 years of conflict between us and the Palestinians is over the difference between 97% of the land and 100% of the land, even there we've offered them 100% 15 years ago. It's not that at all. They want the whole thing. They will not accept anything less than all of Israel. They won't say it out loud because it doesn't seem reasonable, but that's their demand. And the rest of the Arab world is looking and saying, you know what? We're tired of trying to go back. We need to move forward. We've got our own countries. We're moving in a completely different direction. And now we're not jumping on their train. They better jump on ours. So the Arab League thing was significant because it pit them and their narrative of, not just their narrative of us, but their narrative of how important they are in the Arab world against the shifts that are going on today. And let's remember, the Arab League is not just Emirates, Bahrain, and Oman. You've got all the other countries who are looking at this and saying, you know what, this issue is just not central to us anymore. We're going to go with the direction that it's going in, and that's critical.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought when that happened, when the Arab League rejected that demand, was that obviously what the Palestinians knew that Oman and Bahrain Bahrain were on board with the United Arab Emirates because they said it immediately.
Right.
But apparently what the Palestinians were hoping for was that the other Arab countries would maybe form a bloc that would marginalize the Gulf states. And the fact that they refused to do so, maybe what it signals for us long term is that those other Arab countries, think about the North African ones and other countries in the Arab world, that perhaps even if they don't go to full normalization anytime soon, they'll probably start moving step by step closer to a kind of unofficial soft normalization, and the whole problem between Israel and the Arab world in general is just going to kind of disintegrate.
Yes. Look, the Arab boycott died. I mean, it was on life support already. We've been doing business with them under the table for years. But even the facade of the boycott is gone. I mean, we're talking now about flyover rights for Israeli planes of Arab countries. Regular Israel to other countries. Let's remember that when Egypt signed the agreement, they were essentially thrown out of the Arab League. And so again, to me, a lot of I'll call it the packaging, because it's not peripheral, but a lot of the packaging is almost more important than the event itself. And it's not. I don't think it's getting quite as much.
The packaging is the narrative. The packaging is the narrative.
That's right.
All right, let's move on.
It shines a light on the BDS movement.
Yeah.
It's like,
all right, Elliot, let's move on to another topic, which of course everything relates in the Middle East. But this is just more, celebration and kind of an addendum to the UAE deal. Right. There was another news story that was kind of under the radar, and I think even people who watch Israel closely may have missed it. And it was interesting, it was unusual, and the timing really was a question mark for me, which is, there was a news story that broke a few days ago that the United States, the State Department, sanctioned some former Lebanese ministers for supporting or providing aid in some way to Hezbollah. Now, this is an interesting little story, and what does it even mean? We have these former Lebanese ministers who I guess weren't supposed to be helping out Hezbollah, and they are, and the United States sanctions them on a personal level. What exactly does this mean, and what is it really about? Can you explain what happened here?
Okay, so first of all, it happens periodically. The State Department finds organizations, companies, banks, individuals who are in material support of terrorist organizations, in this case, Hezbollah, and it sanctions them. The timing matters, I think, for a variety of reasons. The most important one from that story's perspective is that we are now in the aftermath of the Beirut port explosion. There's been a shakeup in Lebanon. Hezbollah is under pressure. Now, this is not the first time that Hezbollah has been under political pressure in Lebanon. And here, I think it's important to emphasize that Hezbollah is a political entity in Lebanon, as well as a military entity in Lebanon, fighting Israel, the West, all sorts of stuff, enemies around. Many people have, I think, misunderstood that its core purpose for existing is to be an armed organization. And the other stuff that it does, like being involved in Lebanese politics, is an adjunct to being an armed organization. It's to facilitate its being an armed organization, and so on. Its first major threat, or the first major threat against it, came in 1989 with the Taif Agreement that essentially ended the Lebanese civil war, but opened Lebanon up to Syria. And in that agreement, all militias, all factions were supposed to disarm. Now, if you are a Lebanese political militia that is now going into some sort of political rearrangement, and everybody else is disarming, So you also disarm.
Meaning
If you're
part of
Hezbollah,
becoming a legitimate political party
right.
in the
In other
Lebanese
words,
political system, so you can't be a guerrilla militia.
well, that's the logic. But it also means that if Lebanon is opening a new arena of discourse, which is going to be purely political and not armed, then we're all in this together. Of course, you keep an arms cache on the side just in case, but you at least publicly disarm. Hezbollah rejected that. It was supposed to disarm after the war in '06. The new and improved United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, UNIFIL, was supposed to oversee their disarming. Right. For them, Hezbollah can't disarm and remain Hezbollah. And anybody who thinks that, and the Europeans, for example, think that there's a political sort of wing and there's a military wing, and you can remove the military wing and remain a political wing, that's Western thinking. Because in Western thinking, your armed force is an extension of your politics. Clausewitz, war is an extension of policy by additional means. Here, Hezbollah's core is its armed force. It doesn't exist without its armed force. So it's under pressure. And under that pressure, on the one hand, it's jockeying to try to maintain position. On the other hand, it's got to build up its military force, which is why there have been, incidentally, additional, more frequent airstrikes of ours in Syria over the past couple of weeks, because they've stepped up their transfer of weapons. The State Department's sanctioning is meant, and it was public, is meant to send a message to those who are supporting Hezbollah, even if you were a former, and I think that's key, we're sanctioning you for what you did. Don't think that you can do it now and get away with it.
It's an important point that you just raised, that it was made public, because something like this sanctioning, obviously the people being sanctioned aren't the ones who let it out publicly. They have no
Correct.
interest in doing that. So if something like this, I guess a good rule of thumb for everyone watching this and listening is that when you see something like this in the news, one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, why do we know this? This isn't an event like an explosion or a plane crash, or, it's not something that's visible to the outside.
Correct.
That means that part of the decision to sanction is the decision to make it public.
I'll take that a step further. Not only to make it public, to make sure that it would be public. Because the story in and of itself isn't all that important, and it's not likely that it would have been picked up if it were just put out in a normal daily sheaf of press releases. Here, somebody picked up the phone to journalists and said, this story is important to get out there.
Interesting.
Okay, and we should keep that in mind when apparently minor stories appear. The question is, who pushed this story into the headlines? Often enough, if the action source is a government body, it means that somebody in that government body picked up the phone and told their pet journalist, this needs to go in. And there is such thing. The pet journalist.
Well, that's why, this is why I asked the whole question
Right.
about this news story, because when I saw it in the news, I was like, what an odd little detail.
Okay. So now who's on the receiving end of this? Obviously, organizations, banks. Iran doesn't care. The militias don't care. But I saw another article this past week that ties into this, and it's very interesting. And that is that Qatar has been found to be heavily involved in funding and arming Hezbollah.
Meaning they're helping Iran?
Yes.
Because again, one of Elliot Chodoff's rules is that Hezbollah is not a separate thing. Hezbollah
Correct.
is simply a branch of Iran.
Correct.
And therefore, if Qatar is funding Hezbollah, that means that Qatar is directly funding an Iranian.
Right.
It's not even proxy, an Iranian force.
Right. They're going in with the Iranians against the Arabs. And here, again, let's remember, this is not just a simple Sunni Shiite issue. This is an Arab-Persian issue.
Is Qatar Arab or Persian?
Arab.
So isn't that okay?
Counterintuitive.
Why?
They're also okay.
What's
because
Qatar's motive?
they are very, very hardline radical. They will support Hezbollah for its Islamism. They will support Iran for its Islamism. They're the outlier in all of this. They support Hamas heavily. The report that I read said that they gave Hezbollah $500 million. That's a substantial sum. That's a major proportion of what Iran gives them. It's not a trivial amount of money, relatively or absolutely. I mean, 500 million would probably get you and me pretty far personally. So I think that there are messages going out to places like that as well, saying, you know what, we're watching, we're keeping an eye on these things, and we'll sanction, you know, quasi-nobodies who are retired. Think about what you're doing. Now, between us, I don't think it makes much of a difference. Qatar doesn't care anymore, and certainly Iran doesn't care. But it means that America is going on record as we're in this conflict and we're paying attention to it. And I think that's really the important message. If we take it in contrast to the previous administration, which covered up a massive Hezbollah drug running operation in the United States in order to basically not offend Iran during the negotiation over the Iran deal. Hezbollah was involved in a massive cocaine running, selling operation in the US. They were making a huge amount of money. Yeah. The DEA was told by the Obama administration to lay off. And they had their sights on major drug dealers, and along with them, major arms dealers in America and outside. And they were told, back off. The Iran deal is more important, and if we do this, it may mess up the outcome. So here we see, you know, absolute contrast. Now, again, you know, I'm not getting into American politics here on the level of, and therefore, you know, support this or that candidate. I'm talking about the Obama administration under Obama. He was the one making decisions. And here we have an American administration that's going, that from the outset went in the exact opposite direction vis-a-vis Iran, said Iran is the enemy, Iran is an adversary, and we're dealing with them as such. They want to talk, they want to negotiate, that's fine, but we're not starting from the perspective of we're all buddies and it's all a great misunderstanding. So I think that's the story that you read is another small bit of a much wider policy that we've been seeing over the past 4 years, 3.5 years.
Well, so what's the current state of Qatar's relationship with the other countries in the Arab League?
Not good. They're not happy with them. Now they're in there. They're not at war, but the more Western-oriented countries, which is most of them. Now, again, let's keep in mind, you have the non-countries like Syria, Iraq, let's say, in Libya. There as well, Lebanon, Libya, exactly, Yemen, that don't really count.
They don't really have governments.
Well, they have governments, but they don't. I mean, Libya has 2 governments.
That's exactly my point, right?
You know, the basic rule is there a return address? That's the kind of term that I use. The German sociologist, classical sociologist Max Weber, a century ago, said that a state is the political entity that holds a monopoly on the use of violence within its borders. In other words, now monopoly is obviously 100%, but it is the ruler of its territory. And these are countries where the governments don't rule their territory.
Right. Right. Like
So,
the Lebanese government doesn't rule Lebanon.
no.
Right.
No. The Lebanese army is the second most powerful army in Lebanon. Serious. Hezbollah is more powerful. Okay, the Syrian army is what? The Libyan army doesn't even exist. So these aren't real countries, even if they have the facade of sovereignty of, you know, a flag and a capital and a vote at the UN to vote against us and that sort of thing. So their opinions don't matter that much. The other countries are not happy. I mean, the other countries are countries like Morocco and Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Again, the Emirates, Bahrain, they're not happy with that. They don't want radicalization. These are countries that want stability. They're fighting radicals in their own countries, some more openly than others. I mean, there's a major war going on.
And they also want economic progress.
Well, stability and progress.
Yeah.
And that's not coming from Iran and Hezbollah. So I think that battle lines are being drawn up. I think the U.S. has recognized them in the past few years in a way that it hadn't in the prior 8. They were fuzzier before that for a whole bunch of reasons. And again, the analysts who were following it, like myself, knew to draw them up even before then. But there was a great deal of confusion. That confusion is much less there, if you will. Now it's a question of choosing which side of the line you want to be on.
You know, so just if we could just tie a bow on this conversation, and obviously every conversation I'm always like, wow, we could go on for hours. What you've done in these last few minutes is really tying together both stories that we were talking about, which is the story about Bahrain,
yes,
and the story about the sanctioning of these Hezbollah ministers, which was like only a story because someone decided it has to be a story, which itself is very interesting. If we put it all together, what's happening here is the United States is basically saying, look, we're involved, we're paying attention. There's a camp that is growing and moving forward that wants our way. The Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia quietly, although they have other pressures with Mecca and Medina that they may never officially normalize, even though they're kind of normalized already. Egypt is in the same category, almost. Morocco is on the way, and we know this, right? So we have that group, and the United States is basically saying, if you're going to be with Hezbollah, if you're going to be with Iran, if you're going to be with Qatar, we have our eye on you.
Yes.
And you know, and this is, I guess, this is where Abbas and the Palestinian Authority really, really messed up.
Yes.
By coming out and declaring how opposed they are to all these things, as opposed to saying, you know, they could have made a statement like, we want to wait and see. We look forward to meeting with the leaders of the Emirates to talk about
our issues.
They could have chosen so many other approaches to this without saying that they're happy about it, and kept themselves in the discussion. And they're basically writing themselves out of the discussion, putting themselves into the Hezbollah Hamas category.
Right.
And we'll see. It's still a dynamic situation.
They're also being encouraged to do that by the professional peacemakers who've been at this for decades and failed, whether it's European or American, who are saying, but what about the Palestinians? What about the Palestinians? When Sadat came to Jerusalem in '77, nobody said, but what about the Palestinians? It was, right, you know, terrific. Likewise, when Hussein signed the agreement. Now it's like, no, this is no good. We can't, how can this go forward without the Palestinians? Like, guess what? Your paradigm is wrong.
Wow. All right, Elliot, we're going to stop here.
Okay.
Everyone, just to remind everybody, next week is Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is a 2-day holiday. It's going to be this coming Saturday, Shabbat, and Sunday. So we are going to be a day late, or we could actually maybe Elliot, maybe we'll try to do this on Friday.
We can try,
And
but
get it out before
the
Shabbat.
day
We'll see.
before, we'll try.
So we'll just be patient with us, folks. We're not going to be on schedule next week, but we have a lot to talk about. I feel like we've opened up a lot of doors, and now we have to explore them all in the coming weeks. So
I call it, we've written a lot of checks, now we have to cash them.
yeah, but the headlines never stop. So
No.
Everyone, thank you for watching. Please continue to share and tell people about this. I keep receiving feedback from people that this is far more substantive than anything they get in the news media about Israel, and we appreciate that. I'm going to reiterate what I said, and a few have taken us up on this. I have to talk, Elliot, I got to talk to you about some requests for appearances. Okay. If you would like a briefing, if you would like a discussion, if you would like one of us, Elliot or myself, to share with your group in your, through Zoom, we are more than happy to do it. And keep praying for Israel, and have a wonderful Rosh Hashanah.